Hey everybody, it's Kneecap here, and in this video I'm going to be talking about improving rating in retail World of Warcraft, specifically about Mythic rating, but you could take the same ideas and apply them to other difficulties like Heroic or whatever, if it, pertain to it. And a lot of it will not, but, some of it will. I have tons of thoughts on this, to be frank. I could talk about this for probably hours about minor things to improve, but instead of doing that, I'm going to break it into parts. So this video specifically will be about uh, raid composition in Mythic raiding. And this is something I don't think gets talked about enough. It gets talked about in some aspects of it, like who to bring or who gets left out. The current thing is like shamans getting left out or whatever. And that gets talked about, but I'm not talking about who to bring. I'm talking about completing a fight because of raid composition, right? And so that's what I'm going to be talking about in this particular video. So a little bit about me first, just in case you're from outside the channel watching this. I've gotten cutting edge every tier since the last tier of Legion. That Antorus the Burning Throne, I believe, would have been that tier, and gotten C every tier basically with the same guild. We've kind of changed over the years, and we're right around the World 1000 mark. And I always hear higher end people say that they want to know the opinion of like a World 1000 CE raider, and here it is. We raid 6 hours per week. That's it. Two nights of 3 hours, and that's what we do. And and for those people who don't know, while there is World 1000, a lot of tiers, 2000 guilds, get CE, and I'd love to know what the 2000th guild thoughts were on getting CE personally. So I'd love to know that. But anyways, let's dive into raid comp. So what do I mean by raid comp? This doesn't get talked about enough. I think because of this, at the very high end, it is not that hard because a lot of people at the very highest end who play World of Warcraft all the time, they have multiple characters that they might have ready to go for any given tier. And if you need a DK or a warlock or a priest or this or that, somebody has an alt or something that they can just switch to, and they happily do it because they were choosing between that and something else anyway, and they want to feel important, so they choose the thing that the guild, the group really needs. However, when you get into the more casual area, where I'm at, you do not have that luxury. Not many people are going to have alts ready to go. And by ready to go, I mean like fully geared, ready to go. And honestly, when it comes down to it, if a fight actually forces you to have a certain amount of a class or a spec or whatever, and someone has to re-roll, it's actually very detrimental to a more casual guild, because the person forced to play that probably isn't having fun. They probably aren't as good at it, and you're already working at the margins anyways, like as far as like skill, right? The highest skill people are all in like the top 100 or whatever. So you're working on a lower skill threshold, and then they're playing a class that they don't know or don't like, and so it becomes very, very detrimental. So let's talk a little bit about some random fights that kind of like force you in some ways to complete the fight at any reasonable amount of time, that kind of force you into playing a certain composition, right? So the current thing with Amir Jasil. Amir Jasil is actually pretty good as far as not needing to have a certain raid comp for most of the fights. And the early fights don't matter as much to me because they're not as hard. So I'm talking more about later fights just in general. However, I will say on Farak, right, which is the boss that I'm currently progging, with the Nox, right? So in phase 2 of Farak, you have to knock a bunch of little ads and group them all together, essentially. Now, we are lucky enough that we do have a Blood Death Knight, so we do have the mass script for the final Sug, but we do not have a ton of Nox available in our group. And it's not as easy for us just to be like, oh, well, go get on your character that has a knock, and do this. So this makes this part of the fight a little bit challenging because we have to execute it perfectly. We don't really have much in terms of backups for it. We have like one backup thing if something goes wrong, and it's a Ring of Peace to knock if something goes wrong. And I know other guilds have completed it with that in mind as well, right? I'm not saying it's impossible, and we will complete the fight as is if needed. And we even went on Heroic to practice doing the Nox, and we can do it, and we can do it very quickly if we do it perfectly. However, this is one of those things where it's very almost impossible for a guild like ours to build a raid comp that also has like, oh, also we have 7 knocks in case we need knockbacks for a fight. And so, or we only have 1 DK. If we had 2 DKs, one could have slappy hands or something, right? And help grip in that way. But with the tools we have, it makes it much more difficult. Whereas for a higher end guild, they can have someone come on a character that has a knock or something, so they have like an extra druid that has a better knock or whatever the case may be, right? And at the very, very highest end, everyone can just go call Tyrion, or they can pay real money to have an advantage essentially for a fight like this one. So that's an example here. However, this expansion in general hasn't had a ton. So Phyrexia has that little thing with the knocks. In Aberrus, there wasn't really a huge contention of having to have a certain spec or certain composition to do a fight. However, there's always going to be some things, and we're going to talk about that. In Vault, the big thing for Vault was Raszageth with the knockbacks. Until the nerf, there's literally some specs that just couldn't do it, right? Or you had to have evokers to grip your priests or whatever. That kind of thing. Again, that makes it very hard on comp. Now, obviously, that got nerfed to be doable or whatever. But just in general, I don't think fights should be designed that way, because I think it's like unnecessary difficulty, because it's difficulty due to raid composition. Now, we have some other things. Just in general, Shadowlands. Shadowlands was the king of needing Warlock gates. Either that or everyone had to go Venthyr. You needed so many Warlock gates in Shadowlands. You also need a lot of Mass Dispels in Shadowlands. In Nathria, you needed DKs. If you had multiple DKs, that was a great thing. That was a great problem to have in Castle Nathria. And we could go on and on. And what do these things bring? DKs bring a niche thing, a grip, or a mass grip, or slappy hands. That's a very niche thing that sometimes a fight is built around. Warlock gates, a very niche thing. Only they can do it. Only one class has a gate. And when you need lots of them, so go back to G'huun, for example, we had to have people get on alts that they didn't know how to play that well, and just so we could have the gateways to do G'huun. And that's not fun, and that's not good design. And again, at the very higher end of the spectrum, it's not that big of a deal, because the person going from mage to warlock is playing that warlock probably at the same level that they're playing their mage at, or very close to it. And there's a more competitive nature at the very high end, whereas at World 1000, ultimately we want to get CE, we want to have that accomplishment, but we are doing it mostly just for fun. And it's not as fun when you're forced to play a specker class that you don't want to play. Whereas someone who's like, well, we really want to make sure we stay in the Hall of Fame, or we really want to be top 20 this tier, you have this competitive thing going for you that makes switching a specker class maybe less harmful. Now, they still might be having less fun and ultimately stop doing it because they're having less fun. But the thing remains that there is just a big difference between the high end and the middle end or the back end, whatever you want to think of, around the 1,000 mark as. So when it comes to this, what I would say to the devs, the designer of these fights, is try to keep in mind raid comp when you're making the fight. Now, I know in some fights they're like, oh, well, Warlock gate is needed here. I think it's fine to need 1 Warlock gate. It's completely reasonable for a mythic guild to always have a Warlock on staff, for lack of a better phrase. That's completely fine. I also think it's fine to need 1 grip or 1 spot where you need slappy hands or something like that in a fight. And it's completely reasonable to have 1 DK on your roster, or somebody who likes to play DK on their roster, even if they're not currently maining it. I think that's completely reasonable, again, to have 1. I think it's completely reasonable to have 1 fight in a raid tier, 1 towards the end fight, where you need to have a Mass Dispel. I think it's completely reasonable to have 1 priest in your raid group. I think it's completely reasonable to have 1 paladin in your raid group because you need Blessing of Freedom. Right? I think the issue comes when you start needing multiples of something, because that becomes a lot less likely for an average guild to have access to, essentially, multiple of these things. And we were just talking about that with the knocks on Phyrexia, right? Now it's not super reasonable unless you just get lucky that that everyone just happened to be playing a class with Nox that tier or whatever. It's not super likely that you're going to have a perfect raid comp for that. Going into a tier or any tier like that. And so that's an example of needing too many. G'huun is an example of, in order to do the fight in any reasonable way, it's not that you couldn't do it without the Warlock gates, without all the multiples of Warlock gates. It's just that it made it so much harder. Like the difficulty level was so much that it actually was better and quicker for people to play on their alts playing Warlocks, unfortunately, because I wish that wasn't the case. So having to have multiple Warlock gates is very, very bad, right? Having to use multiple Warlock gates is not a good design of a fight. You need to keep that in mind. It's completely reasonable to have one instance to use it during a fight, but it becomes completely unreasonable if you need like 3 or 4, because even 2 you can make an argument for. But once you start, you can't. 2 is like probably too many. Once you go over 2, it's just unreasonable at that point. Yeah, I wish this was talked about more, but again, I don't think, because it's more when it comes to PvE mythic rating, right? Who has the largest audience? You know, the people that are the best at it, right? The people at the higher end, which completely makes sense, but they're also not experiencing this composition problem that everyone else is experiencing. Now, why is this so important? What's this whole narrative? So the narrative is, there's this huge narrative about fixing mythic rating, fixing WoW retail rating and stuff like that. And I'm somebody who wishes there were more mythic CE guilds. So I wish that instead of 2,000 a tier, there was like 4,000 a tier, or 5,000 a tier. You know, 100,000 people getting CE instead of 40,000 people getting CE, right? That's what I wish. I think that would be really healthy for the game. And you don't have to make the raids that much easier. You don't have to make them that much easier. They would have to be easier, of course, but not that much easier to accomplish that, in my opinion. Now, if my guild at, you know, rank 1,000 or whatever, isn't able to put together these comps with multiples of everything that they need for any given raid tier, any given boss fight, how do you think the 5,000th guild, if let's say the goal was Blizzard wanted 100,000 people to get CE, how in the world is the 5,000th guild going to complete these raid tiers where you need, you know, multiple of something like 3 gates or 4 gates or something like that, right? How are they going to complete that would be my question to ask the developers, because it's not going to happen. Because what's going to happen in those guilds is they're going to have like 5 people randomly playing Paladin because they just have a lot of Paladins, and they might have 4 Druids. And on this tier, Paladins and Druids might be bad or something, right? And they still need to be able to complete the raid. Even though, you know, again, I think it's completely reasonable that they need to have 1 Warlock, they need to have 1 Priest, you know, stuff like that. I do think that stuff is reasonable, but you're going to have less, the comps are going to get less and less ideal as you go further and further down towards the very last people who get cutting edge or whatever. So again, this is just a topic I don't see talked about very much, or ever maybe, in this terms. I see the raid comp talked about in terms of, well, this many melee slots, this many range slots, well, you have to bring a Warlock, you have to bring this. And I think that's important because it's part of that discussion, right? Is that, well, you have to bring a Warlock, and I'm saying, yeah, you're designing a fight to bring 1 Warlock, but then what happens if you have to bring 3 Warlocks, right? And for the, let's say Max, right? Max is very good at talking about this, and he is very open-minded to hearing people from the lower end guilds talk about it as well. You know, he might just say, well, I have to bring 3 Warlocks, and he just says it like nothing, because it's not an issue for him to find 3 Warlocks or 3 people to play Warlock in his guild if needed, right? To go for world first. That's not going to be an issue. He could have 6 Warlocks if he needed it, or if he really, really needed to, right? Just like they would have stacked augmentation evokers if that was what was needed to do. You know, it wouldn't have been an issue. Whereas for my guild, it's a big issue. For any guilds further down, if you want to increase the amount of people getting cutting edge, or trying to get cutting edge even, you're going to have to loosen up the raid comp restrictions. And this is just one aspect. I have other aspects. I'll do more videos on this. I'll try to get them all out within like a week or two, talking about these issues in mythic rating that I see from my perspective. But this is one I wanted to do first because, again, it's just not one I see talked about very much. So That's going to be it for this one. Like I said, hopefully more coming in like a series of these. As always, I do ask you to please subscribe to my channel because it helps me out so much. And other than that, everybody have a good one.